No one expects a quiet school bus ride to hide something terrifying, but that afternoon, one small detail changed everything. Orson Pike had driven the same route in Dayton, Ohio for nearly a decade. At 64, with a lifetime behind him as a mechanic, he had grown used to routines. The hum of the engine, the chatter of teenagers, the rhythm of stops along familiar suburban streets. Nothing surprised him anymore. Or at least, that's what he believed, until he noticed Maribel Voss. She wasn't loud like the others. She didn't laugh, didn't scroll her phone with friends, didn't argue over music or weekend plans. She sat alone, always 3 rows from the front, right above the floor vent, her brown hair falling like a curtain that hid her face. At first, Orson thought she was just another new kid trying to adjust. But by the 3rd afternoon, a pattern emerged that he couldn't ignore. Every single day, without fail, Maribel cried. Not openly. Not dramatically. She waited. She held it in while the bus was full. Then, as students got off one by one and the noise faded, her shoulders would slump, her hands would move quickly to wipe tears she didn't want anyone to see. It was quiet, controlled, almost practiced, but it was real. And it was getting worse. Orson had seen troubled kids before. He knew the difference between a bad day and something deeper. This wasn't a bad day. This was fear. That afternoon, something else caught his attention. As the bus turned a corner, he saw Maribel suddenly lean forward, her arm reaching under her seat. There was a faint metallic sound, out of place, sharp enough to make him glance again in the mirror. When he asked if everything was okay, she answered too quickly, too softly, saying she had just dropped a tissue. But Orson noticed something she didn't. She hadn't been holding any tissue. By the time the last stop came, the unease had already taken root in his chest. Maribel stepped off slowly, avoiding eye contact, her eyes swollen, her face pale. Her house sat at the end of a quiet street, a worn 2-story place with peeling blue paint. When the door opened, a man appeared. Tall. Still. Expressionless. Maribel hesitated for a fraction of a second before going inside. That moment stayed with Orson. The look on her face wasn't sadness anymore. It was something much harder to ignore. It was the look of someone who didn't feel safe going home. He told himself he might be overthinking it. That grief, stress, and teenage life could explain everything. But as he drove back toward the depot, the image replayed over and over in his mind. The crying, the sudden movement under the seat, the forced explanation, the silent fear. Something wasn't right. And for the first time in years, Orson Pike didn't trust the routine anymore. So after parking the bus and beginning his usual end-of-day check, he stopped when he reached Maribel's seat. The same spot. The same vent. The same place where her hand had disappeared earlier. He crouched down slowly, his joints stiff, his instincts louder than his doubts. There was nothing visible at first glance. No trash. No tissue. But then he saw it, a narrow gap between the seat base and the vent cover. Just enough space for something small to be hidden. Orson slid his fingers into the gap. For a second, there was nothing. Then, something smooth. Unfamiliar. He pulled it out carefully. And the moment it caught the light, his breath stopped. A small plastic packet. Pink pills. Partially used. His hands froze as his mind struggled to catch up with what he was seeing. A girl barely in her teens. crying every day, hiding something beneath her seat. This wasn't just strange anymore. This was serious. As Orson sat back in the driver's seat, staring at the pills in his hand, one thought settled in with chilling clarity. Whatever Maribel was hiding was only the beginning. The moment Orson Pike realized what he was holding, the world around him seemed to narrow into something sharp and urgent. The quiet bus, the empty seats, the fading sunlight outside. It all blurred behind a single pressing thought. This was not something a 14-year-old girl should be hiding under a bus seat. He turned the small packet over in his hand, studying it with the same careful attention he once gave to engine parts. Years of fixing machines had taught him that small components often pointed to bigger problems. This felt no different. The label confirmed his suspicion. Birth control pills. Not new. Already used. That detail unsettled him the most. It meant this wasn't a one-time mistake or curiosity. It was ongoing, planned, hidden. And suddenly, all the pieces from the past few days began to align in a way that made his stomach tighten. The quiet crying. The isolation. The sudden movements under the seat. The pale face. The way Maribel avoided eye contact. The way she flinched when spoken to. This wasn't just a troubled teenager. This was someone carrying something far too heavy alone. Orson didn't act impulsively. He wasn't that kind of man. But he also wasn't someone who ignored what was right in front of him. He took out his phone and documented everything. Clear photos of the packet, the location where he found it, the seat number. His hands were steady, but inside, the unease was growing stronger by the second. He knew this needed to be reported. So he reached out to the school administration, sending the images along with a brief explanation. He expected urgency, concern, direction. Instead, he got silence. When he called, the response was distracted, impatient. The issue was acknowledged, but not treated as immediate. There were meetings, priorities, procedures. It would be looked at later. Later. That word didn't sit right with him. Because whatever was happening to Maribel didn't feel like something that could wait. Orson leaned back in the driver's seat, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had done what protocol required, but it didn't feel like enough. Not even close. His instincts, sharpened by years of observing people more than machines, were telling him one thing very clearly. Something was wrong, and it was getting worse. He locked the bus, handed in his keys, and walked toward his old sedan, but his mind never left that seat. That packet. That girl. As he drove out of the depot, he realized his route home would pass right by Maribel Street. At first, he told himself to keep going. That he had already done his part. That stepping further might cross a line. But then he remembered her face. Not just the tears, but the fear behind them. Without fully deciding, his foot eased off the gas. At the next intersection, he made a slow turn back. The house looked the same as before. Quiet. Still. Too still. He parked across the street and watched for a moment, expecting to see movement, a sign of normal life. There was none. No lights. No shadows behind curtains. No sound. Less than an hour had passed since he dropped her off. It didn't make sense. Orson stepped out of the car and approached the front door, knocking firmly. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He moved to the window and glanced inside. Darkness. Empty space. No sign of anyone being home. A cold feeling settled in his chest. They had left. Quickly. Too quickly. He returned to his car and pulled out the emergency contact list he kept for his route. Maribel's information was there, along with the name of her guardian, Cormac Bell. The same man who had stood in the doorway earlier with that unreadable expression. Orson called the number. It rang. And rang. Then went to voicemail. No response. He ended the call slowly, staring at the phone as questions piled up faster than answers. Why leave so suddenly? Why not answer? Where would they go? He sat there for a moment longer, caught between uncertainty and instinct. Then he started the engine. If he couldn't get answers directly, he would find them another way. He drove back onto the main road, his thoughts racing, eyes scanning everything around him without even realizing it. The city passed in a blur of familiar signs and intersections, until something caught his attention. A small figure stepping out of a pharmacy. He slowed instantly. It was Maribel. Alone. She looked worse than before. Pale. Unsteady. One arm wrapped around her stomach as if trying to hold something in place. Her movements were slow, strained, like every step took effort. Orson pulled over without hesitation this time. Whatever doubt he had earlier was gone. Because this was no longer just a suspicion. This was a situation unfolding right in front of him, and it was getting more serious by the second. By the time Orson Pike saw Maribel Voss step out of the pharmacy alone, whatever hesitation he once had disappeared completely. The situation had moved beyond quiet concern into something urgent and unpredictable. She didn't look like someone running an errand. She looked like someone trying to endure something. Her steps were uneven, her posture tense, one hand pressed tightly against her abdomen as if she was fighting off a wave of pain. The late afternoon light only made her pale complexion more obvious. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone around her, moving with the kind of guarded awareness that didn't belong to a child. Orson stayed where he was, watching carefully. He didn't approach this time. Earlier, his attempt to check on her had backfired, drawing unwanted attention and pushing her further away. Now, he understood that acting too directly could do more harm than good. Whatever was happening, Maribel didn't feel safe enough to accept help openly. So he did the only thing he could think of. He watched. From across the street, he kept his distance, his eyes never leaving her. He noticed how she paused briefly near a trash can, bending forward slightly, her body reacting in a way that confirmed what he already feared. She was physically unwell. This wasn't stress. This wasn't just emotion. Something deeper was affecting her. Orson's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. The pills. The nausea. The secrecy. The fear. It was starting to form a picture he didn't want to believe. But before he could decide his next move, everything shifted again. A familiar car pulled up near the curb. Cormac Bell stepped out. The same rigid posture. The same unreadable face. The same unsettling calm. He moved toward Maribel with controlled purpose, not rushed, not concerned, just deliberate. From where Orson sat, the interaction between them felt wrong. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just wrong in a way that didn't need words to explain it. Mirabelle followed him without resistance. That detail alone tightened something in Orson's chest. There was no argument. No hesitation. Just quiet compliance. They got into the car. And then they drove off. For a brief moment, Orson stayed frozen in place, gripping the steering wheel as his thoughts collided. He had already contacted the school. He had already tried to check on her. He had already crossed into territory most people would avoid. But none of that had changed anything. Mirabelle was still out there. Still with that man. Still clearly in distress. The decision came faster than he expected. Orson started the engine. He didn't speed. He didn't rush. He simply followed, keeping enough distance to avoid being noticed, but close enough not to lose sight of them. His years of driving had taught him patience, control, and awareness. Now, those instincts were guiding him through something far more serious than traffic patterns. The route they took didn't make sense. They weren't heading home. They weren't heading toward a clinic or a hospital. They were leaving the residential area entirely. As the streets became less crowded and the buildings more spaced out, a new layer of unease settled in. The direction pointed toward the outskirts of the city, toward quieter, less populated areas where fewer people would notice anything unusual. Orson's grip tightened slightly. This was no longer a coincidence. This was intentional. While keeping his eyes on the road ahead, he reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts. If the school administration wasn't responding, someone else had to know more. Someone closer to Mirabelle's daily life. Her teacher. Ms. Harlow Finch. He called, placing the phone on speaker, his voice steady despite the tension building inside him. As the call connected, he kept his attention divided, one part focused on the road, the other on gathering whatever information he could. What he learned only confirmed his fears. Mirabelle hadn't just been quiet, she had been withdrawing, avoiding interaction, leaving class repeatedly, showing signs of illness that had been dismissed as minor issues. Even earlier that day, she had been found resting in an empty room instead of going to the school clinic. No one had connected the dots. No one had acted. Until now. Orson shared what he had found: the pills, the hiding place, the behavior. The reaction on the other end of the call shifted immediately from concern to alarm. This was no longer a vague situation. It was a pattern. And it was escalating. As the call ended, Orson's focus returned fully to the car ahead. Cormac's vehicle slowed slightly before turning into a wide, open area surrounded by trees and scattered structures. A public park near a lake. Quiet, partially empty at this hour, with long stretches of space between visitors. Not isolated enough to raise immediate suspicion, but quiet enough for something to happen unnoticed. Orson drove past once before circling back, choosing a parking spot far enough away to avoid attention. From there, he watched as Cormac and Mirabelle stepped out of the car. Cormac carried a small cooler. Mirabelle walked behind him. Not beside. Not freely. Behind. Her movements were slower now, more strained, her posture reflecting exhaustion more than anything else. There was no sign of resistance, but there was also no sign of comfort. They moved toward a picnic area. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Too ordinary. And that was what made it worse. because nothing about this situation felt normal anymore. Orson stepped out of his car, blending into the environment as best as he could, keeping his distance while tracking their movements. He positioned himself where he could observe without being obvious, his senses sharpened by the growing tension in the air. For a moment, he considered the possibility that this might still be nothing more than a misunderstanding. That maybe this was just a strange, uncomfortable family dynamic. That maybe everything would settle. But then he saw them. 3 men approaching. They weren't part of the park's casual visitors. Their movement was direct, focused, intentional. Cormac greeted them like he had been expecting them. And just like that, the last trace of doubt vanished. Because whatever was about to happen next was planned. The moment the 3 men approached and Cormac Bell greeted them like familiar allies, every instinct Orson Pike had was no longer whispering, it was screaming. There was no confusion left. No harmless explanation. No room for doubt. This was planned. From where he stood, partially hidden behind a row of trees, Orson watched the scene unfold with a rising sense of dread. The men didn't linger. There was no casual interaction, no sign of coincidence. Their body language was efficient, purposeful. After a brief exchange, Cormac gestured toward Maribel. She stood still for a second. Not refusing. Not agreeing. Just frozen. Then she moved. Again, not beside him, but behind him. The group began walking away from the open picnic area, heading toward the far edge of the park where fewer people wandered. The path narrowed, the sounds of distant families and passing joggers fading into the background. The atmosphere shifted from public to isolated in a matter of steps. Orson followed. Carefully. Quietly. Every movement measured, every step placed with intent. His heart was beating harder now, but his focus remained sharp. Years of working alone, solving problems in silence, had trained him to stay steady under pressure. But this wasn't an engine failure. This wasn't a broken part he could fix with tools and time. This was something far more dangerous. Ahead of them stood a small, plain maintenance building. White paint, slightly worn, a single door, narrow windows high on the wall. The kind of structure most people ignored without a second thought. But Orson saw what mattered. One of the men reached into his pocket. A key. The door wasn't supposed to be open. Yet it was. That single detail confirmed everything. They weren't just wandering. They had access. They had a destination. And they had a plan. The door opened and one by one, they went inside, Cormac first, the others following and Maribel last. The door closed behind them. The sound of its sealing shut echoed louder than it should have in the quiet air. Orson didn't hesitate anymore. He stepped back, pulling out his phone with hands that were steady despite the surge of adrenaline running through him. He dialed emergency services, giving the exact location, describing what he had seen, forcing himself to remain calm and precise. Every second mattered. The operator confirmed units were on the way. Minutes. Just minutes. But Orson knew how long minutes could feel when someone was in danger. He moved closer. Not recklessly. Not blindly. But enough to see. The building had a small window, clouded with dust and positioned just high enough to make visibility difficult. Orson approached carefully, wiping part of the glass with his sleeve, straining to look inside. What he saw froze him where he stood. Maribel was backed against the wall. Surrounded. Her body was tense, her face streaked with tears she was no longer trying to hide. The men stood around her, closing in, their presence overwhelming, their movements controlled but unmistakably threatening. Cormac stood closest. Not protective. Not concerned. Dominant. The atmosphere inside that room wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, which made it far more dangerous. Orson's chest tightened as the reality settled in completely. Everything he had suspected, everything he feared, it was worse. Much worse. He relayed what he was seeing into the phone, his voice low but urgent, every detail counted, every second documented. The operator assured him officers were close. Too close to turn back. Too far to relax. Behind him, the quiet park continued as if nothing was happening. Families. Valkas. Distant laughter. No one else knew. No one else could see. And that made Orson the only barrier between what was happening inside that building and what could happen next. Time stretched painfully. Every second dragged. Then, movement. A shift inside the room. Something had changed. Orson leaned slightly closer, trying to understand what was happening, when suddenly he felt it. A presence behind him. Close. Too close. His body reacted instantly, turning sharply, his heart jumping as he came face to face with two men in running gear. They had approached silently, unnoticed in the tension of the moment. For a split second, everything balanced on the edge of misunderstanding. But Orson didn't panic. He explained, quickly, directly, urgently. Their expressions changed. From confusion to concern. Then to something else. Determination. They looked through the same window. Saw the same thing. And in that moment, Orson realized something critical. He wasn't alone anymore. But before any plan could form, a sound broke the silence. Faint at first, then unmistakable. From inside the building. A cry. Sharp. Desperate. It cut through everything. And just as quickly, another sound followed. Distant. Growing louder. Sirens. Approaching fast. The tension snapped into motion. The two men moved toward the door without hesitation, acting on instinct, urgency overriding caution. Orson stayed close, his phone still in hand, his focus split between the building and the approaching sound of help. The door. Still locked. But not for long. Inside, the movement grew more chaotic. Outside, the sirens closed in. Everything was about to collide. And for the first time since this began, there was a chance. A real chance. That Maribel wouldn't have to face it alone. When the sirens finally tore through the stillness of the park, everything shifted from quiet danger to explosive reality. The illusion of control inside that small maintenance building shattered in an instant. What had been hidden, calculated, and contained was now exposed. Police vehicles cut across the gravel paths with urgency, tires crunching hard as officers stepped out with trained precision. There was no hesitation in their movements. No uncertainty. The situation had already crossed the threshold where caution gave way to action. The door didn't stay closed for long. Within seconds, it was forced open. What followed was fast, overwhelming, and decisive. Inside, the carefully constructed silence broke apart under the weight of authority. The men who had once stood confidently around Maribel were no longer in control. Their composure cracked as commands filled the confined space. Some reacted immediately, dropping any resistance, while others hesitated just long enough to reveal their intent before realizing it was over. Cormac Bell stood out among them. Even in that moment, there was resistance in him. Not panic, not confusion, but defiance. It flickered across his expression before reality forced him to comply. The situation had moved beyond anything he could manipulate or control. And in the middle of it all, Maribel. Still against the wall. Still small. Still overwhelmed. But now, no longer alone. An officer moved toward her carefully, the tone of the room shifting just enough to create space between her and the threat that had surrounded her moments before. The tension in her body didn't disappear immediately. It lingered, locked deep inside her, the result of something that had been building long before this moment. Outside, Orson Pike stood just beyond the doorway, watching as everything unfolded with a mixture of relief and disbelief. His heart was still racing, his mind trying to process how quickly everything had escalated, and how close it had come to something far worse. The men were taken out one by one. Restrained. Separated. Removed. Cormac was the last to be led out, his composure now replaced with something darker, something exposed. As he passed by Orson, there was a flash of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had disrupted everything. But Orson didn't move. Didn't react. He simply watched. Because this moment wasn't about confrontation. It was about what came next. The park, once quiet and ordinary, transformed into an active scene of investigation. More units arrived. Medical personnel followed. The area was secured, documented, controlled. Every detail mattered now. Maribel was guided out slowly, carefully. Wrapped in a blanket despite the mild air, her body language still fragile, her movements uncertain. The adrenaline of the moment hadn't reached her yet, or maybe it had, and this was what remained after it passed. Shock. Exhaustion. Relief that didn't fully register. Orson saw her look around, searching without fully knowing what she was looking for. When her eyes found him, something changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. Recognition. A fragile connection. A silent understanding that he had stayed. That he hadn't looked away. That someone had seen her when she thought no one would. As the immediate chaos settled into structured response, the deeper truth began to surface. At the hospital, under the quiet, clinical lights that revealed more than they concealed, Maribel's story slowly unfolded. Not all at once. Not easily. But piece by piece, the fragments aligned into something undeniable. Her mother had been away for weeks, preparing for the birth of another child. A new life entering the world, while another was quietly falling apart. Left behind in that house, Maribel had been alone with Cormac. And what had started as discomfort had turned into something far worse. Something calculated. Something repeated. Fear had kept her silent. Threats had kept her compliant. Isolation had made it feel inescapable. The pills she had hidden weren't a solution. They were a desperate attempt to fix something she didn't fully understand. By the time the truth was confirmed, the weight of it settled heavily across everyone involved. Medical staff, social workers, law enforcement. Each one seeing the same reality from different angles, but arriving at the same conclusion. This had been happening. And it had gone unnoticed. Until it didn't. Orson sat outside the hospital room later that evening, the adrenaline long gone, replaced by a deep, quiet exhaustion. His body felt heavier than it had in years, but his mind remained clear. He hadn't planned any of this. He hadn't expected any of it. All he had done was notice. A pattern. A detail. A feeling that something wasn't right. And instead of ignoring it, he followed it. Inside the room, Maribel was no longer surrounded by fear. She was surrounded by people who knew. People who understood. People who would act. The truth had come out. And even though it carried pain, weight, and consequences, it also carried something else. The beginning of an end to everything she had been forced to endure. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't facing it alone. By the time the night settled over Dayton, the chaos of the afternoon had faded into something quieter, but far heavier. What had started as a small, uneasy observation on a routine bus ride had unraveled into a case that would ripple through lives for years to come. Cormac Bell was no longer a figure standing in a doorway with a blank expression. He was now in custody, facing a series of charges that painted a far more disturbing picture than anyone had initially imagined. As investigators worked through evidence and statements, it became clear this wasn't an isolated incident born from impulse. It was calculated, manipulative, built on control and secrecy. The three men who had been with him at the park quickly became part of that picture. Under pressure, they began to cooperate, revealing details that only confirmed the worst suspicions. Patterns emerged, targeting vulnerable situations, exploiting trust, isolating victims. What had happened to Maribel was not random. It had been allowed to grow. And that realization carried its own weight. Back at the hospital, another kind of urgency unfolded. Maribel's mother, Leona Voss, had arrived in a state no one could have prepared for. 8 months pregnant, overwhelmed by shock, guilt, and fear colliding all at once. The emotional impact hit her body as much as her mind. The stress triggered early labor, turning an already devastating situation into something even more fragile. Within minutes, she was rushed away from the waiting area, surrounded by medical staff, her condition shifting from concern to immediate priority. The life she was carrying demanded attention now, even as the life she had left behind demanded answers. Two realities unfolding at the same time. One ending. One beginning. And in the middle of it all, Maribel. She sat in a hospital room that felt too large for her, wrapped in a gown that made her look even smaller than she already was. The earlier shock had settled into something quieter but deeper. The kind of silence that comes when the mind is trying to process too much at once. Her world had changed in a single day. Everything that had been hidden was now exposed. Everything she had carried alone was now shared. And yet, the uncertainty ahead was just as heavy as what she had left behind. Medical examinations confirmed what had already been suspected. Early pregnancy. Fragile health. Emotional trauma layered over physical reality. The situation demanded decisions. Serious, life-altering decisions that no 14-year-old should ever have to face. Social workers stepped in, not just to manage the situation, but to rebuild something that had been broken long before this day. Safety plans were put into motion. Protective measures were established. The system that had once overlooked subtle warning signs was now fully engaged. But systems alone couldn't fill the space left by fear. That's where something else mattered. Something simpler. Someone who stayed. Orson Pike remained in the background, exactly where he felt he belonged. Not at the center of attention, not seeking recognition, but present. Steady. Reliable. The same way he had been from the moment he first noticed something was wrong. He didn't have the answers to the questions Maribel now faced. He couldn't undo what had happened. He couldn't decide what her future would look like. But he could do one thing. He could not leave. And sometimes that was enough. Hours passed. The hospital moved through its usual rhythm, controlled urgency, quiet conversations, distant footsteps echoing through corridors. Somewhere deeper inside, Leona's condition stabilized as doctors worked carefully through the early labor she hadn't expected. Life continued pushing forward, even under the weight of everything else. Eventually, the pieces began to settle. Not into resolution, but into direction. Investigators confirmed that Cormac would not be released. The evidence was too strong, the testimony too clear. The process ahead would be long, but one outcome was already certain. He would not be returning. And for Maribel, that meant something critical. The threat that had once lived inside her home was gone. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, there was space to breathe. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't remove the fear completely. But it created distance. And distance was the first step toward healing. Later that night, as the hospital lights dimmed slightly and the noise softened into something more manageable, Maribel sat quietly, her thoughts no longer racing, but not yet settled either. She wasn't the same girl who had sat on that bus seat days ago, hiding tears and secrets beneath silence. She had been seen. Truly seen. And that changed something. Not everything. But enough. Orson sat nearby, not speaking, not interrupting, simply present. His role in this had never been about control or direction. It had been about attention. About noticing what others missed. About refusing to ignore something that felt wrong. Small decisions. That led to larger ones. That led to this moment. A girl safe. A truth exposed. A future, uncertain but no longer trapped. As the night stretched forward, one realization remained clear above everything else. None of this started with a dramatic event. It started with something quiet. A glance in a rearview mirror. A pattern of tears. A choice not to look away. And in the end, that choice made all the difference.